On a Tuesday morning in June of 2023, an adjuster from Great Plains Mutual Insurance sat in his rental car outside a farmstead in Kansas and typed the words "claim denied." The tornado had taken every outbuilding on the property. The farmer, Donald, stood in the wreckage, and the company was about to tell him he'd get nothing. They were wrong, because 62 years earlier, his grandfather had signed a single piece of paper. The farmer was Donald Sheffield, 72 years old, standing on land his family had worked for 3 generations. The insurance company's denial letter cited a modern clause about unattached structures. But Donald didn't argue. He just walked into his farmhouse and pulled a faded envelope from a kitchen drawer. Inside was a single, handwritten page from 1961. What was written on that page would force a billion-dollar corporation to reverse its decision and pay every cent. To understand why that piece of paper existed, you have to go back to the spring of 1961, to Donald's grandfather, a man named Walter Sheffield, and a conversation over a kitchen table. Walter Sheffield was 48 years old in 1961. He farmed 480 acres of Kansas wheat and sorghum country. He was a man of few words and absolute routine. Every spring, he would renew his farm's property insurance through the same local agent, a man named Henry Dobbs. Dobbs ran the Farm Bureau Mutual office on Main Street in the town of Colby. He and Walter had done business for 20 years. It was never complicated. Walter would stop in, they'd talk about the weather and the price of wheat. Henry would fill out a standard form. Walter would sign it and write a check. The policy covered the farmhouse, the barn, and what the form called other permanent structures. That was it. Standard. Everyone signed it. But in April of 1961, Walter was building something new. He'd saved for 5 years to put up a machine shed, a long, steel-framed building to shelter his tractor and combines from the hail and wind. It wasn't attached to the house or the barn. It stood 50 yards away. And as he was finishing the concrete pad, a thought occurred to him. He drove into Colby and found Henry Dobbs at his desk. "Henry, this new shed, is it covered under the policy?" Henry pulled Walter's file. He scanned the most recent renewal. He tapped a line on the form. "It says other permanent structures, Walter. I'd say it qualifies." Walter shook his head. "I'd say it don't. Not unless it says so. Permanent is one thing. This is a specific building. I want it specifically listed. I don't want any confusion later." Henry smiled. He was used to farmers who just signed. Walter was different. He'd been different since 1948, when a hailstorm wiped out his wheat crop, and his original insurer had tried to argue that acts of God had a deductible they hadn't mentioned. Walter had fought them for 9 months and won. He'd learned that the only thing that mattered was what was written down. "All right, Walter, how do you want to do this?" "I want you to write it down, right here, that the new machine shed, dimensions 30 by 60, steel frame on a concrete pad, is covered under this policy. Same as the house and the barn. Write it and I'll sign it." Henry didn't have a standard form for that, so he did what agents did in 1961. He took a blank sheet of company letterhead, wrote the date at the top, and in his careful cursive, he wrote a single paragraph. "Addendum to policy number 4721, effective this date. Coverage is hereby extended to include the new machine shed located approximately 150 feet northeast of the main farmhouse, for all perils covered under the main policy. This structure is to be considered a covered permanent outbuilding." He signed his name, Henry Dobbs, agent. He handed the pen to Walter. Walter read it slowly, nodded, and signed his name beneath Henry's. Then Henry did one more thing. He took the original insurance policy, a 3-page document, and he stapled the handwritten addendum to the top of it. He handed the whole packet to Walter. "There you are, now it's part of the contract. You keep that with the policy." Walter Sheffield took the packet home. He placed it in a sturdy envelope, wrote Farm Insurance Policy and Addendum 1961 on the front, and put it in the bottom drawer of the kitchen hutch. He told his son, Donald's father, about it that night at dinner. He said, If anything ever happens to that shed, you show them this paper. The words are right there. That envelope sat in that drawer for 62 years. Through Henry Dobbs retiring and selling his agency. Through Farm Bureau Mutual being bought by a regional company, then by a national conglomerate called Great Plains Mutual. Through Walter passing the farm to his son, and his son passing it to Donald. The policy was renewed every year, automatically, with updated forms and new booklet-sized packets of fine print that arrived in the mail. The original 1961 document was never requested, never reviewed, never digitized. It was just a piece of family history, filed away and forgotten. Until the evening of May 4, 2023. The storm system formed in eastern Colorado just after noon. By 4 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a tornado watch for 7 counties in western Kansas. By 6 p.m., a supercell thunderstorm had developed. At 6:45, radar indicated rotation. At 7:03, a funnel cloud touched down 2 miles southwest of the Sheffield farm. Donald was in the storm cellar with his wife. They listened to the roar above them for 4.5 minutes. When they came out, the sky was an eerie orange. The farmhouse was intact. The barn had lost part of its roof. And the machine shed, the one Walter built in 1961, was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The steel frame was twisted into a knot and thrown 200 yards into a wheat field. The concrete pad was swept clean. Donald stood there in the silence. He didn't panic. He'd been through hail, through drought. This was different, but the procedure was the same. The next morning, he called his insurance agent, a man named Brad who worked for Great Plains Mutual and who he'd never met in person. He filed a claim. He took pictures. He waited. A week later, the adjuster arrived. His name was Mark. He drove a rental car, carried a tablet computer, and was polite but distant. He took his own pictures, measured the foundation of the vanished shed, asked a few questions. He saw the damaged barn, noted it. He told Donald he'd file his report and someone would be in touch. The report was filed. It entered the digital system of Great Plains Mutual. An algorithm flagged it for review. A claims analyst in an office in Des Moines pulled it up. She saw the claim, total loss of an unattached outbuilding, a machine shed. She pulled up Donald Sheffield's policy on her screen. It was the modern, 70-page Great Plains Mutual Agri-Shield policy, last renewed 11 months earlier. She searched the digital document for the term outbuilding. She found the relevant section, subsection C, paragraph 2. It defined covered outbuildings as those permanently affixed and used primarily in conjunction with the dwelling. A standard clause. Then she read the exclusion in paragraph 4. It excluded coverage for structures of a primarily workshop or storage nature, unless specifically endorsed on the policy. She checked the digital file for endorsements. There were none listed for any outbuildings. The algorithm had already compared the claim to the policy language. A red flag popped up, potential coverage issue, unendorsed storage structure. The analyst, following her workflow, drafted a denial letter. She cited paragraph 4 of the outbuildings section. She wrote that the machine shed was considered an unendorsed storage structure and was therefore not covered for loss. She noted the barn roof damage was covered and approved a payment for that. She did not search the company's physical archives for a policy from 1961. No one had entered that data into the system. As far as the digital record was concerned, it didn't exist. The letter arrived at Donald's farm 10 days after the adjuster's visit. Donald opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where his grandfather had signed the addendum. He read the first line. "We have completed our review of your claim." He read the paragraph about the unendorsed storage structure. He read the words "claim denied." He felt a cold numbness, then a slow, deep anger. He looked at the approved amount for the barn roof. It was a fraction of what he needed. The shed had held $15,000 worth of tools, 2 older tractors he used for planting, and all his welding equipment. Gone, and the company was offering nothing. He called Brad, the agent. Brad was sympathetic but powerless. He said, "Donald, I'm looking at the same policy on my screen. It's the standard form. If the shed isn't specifically listed as an endorsed structure, they deny it. It's brutal, but that's the technicality. I'm sorry." Donald hung up. He sat at the table for a long time. He looked around the kitchen. His eyes landed on the old hutch, the bottom drawer. And that's when he remembered. Not the details, but a story. A story his father had told him when he was a boy about his grandfather Walter and a hailstorm, and a lesson about getting things in writing. A story that ended with, "He put the paper in the hutch. Always know what you've got in writing." Donald stood up. He walked to the hutch. He opened the bottom drawer. It was full of old manuals, receipts from the '70s, seed catalogs. He dug toward the back. His fingers touched a thick, yellowed envelope. He pulled it out. The writing on the front was faded but legible. Farm Insurance Policy and Addendum 1961. His hands were steady. He untucked the flap. He pulled out a thin sheaf of papers. The top page was a single sheet of crisp old letterhead. At the top it said Farm Bureau Mutual, and below in faded blue ink was a paragraph of handwritten cursive. He read it. He read the description of the shed. He read the words "Coverage is hereby extended." He saw two signatures, Walter Sheffield, Henry Dobbs, agent. He sat back down. He placed the handwritten page on the table next to the denial letter from Great Plains Mutual. One piece of paper said he had no coverage. The other, signed 62 years earlier, said he did. He knew nothing about contract law. He didn't know what legally binding meant. But he knew what a promise was, and his grandfather had got this promise in writing. He picked up the phone. He didn't call his agent Brad. He looked up the number for the main claims office of Great Plains Mutual. He dialed. When a customer service representative answered, Donald said 7 words. "I have a document you need to see." The customer service representative put Donald on hold. When she came back, her tone had changed from routine to cautious. "Mr. Sheffield, I've spoken with a supervisor. We'd like you to send a scanned copy of this document to our dedicated claims review email. We'll have our historical policies team look at it." Donald didn't have a scanner. He drove 30 miles to the public library in Colby, paid $2 to use the photocopier, and carefully scanned the yellowed addendum and the original 1961 policy it was stapled to. He sent the files. Then he went home and waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th day, his phone rang. It was a different number with a Des Moines area code. "Mr. Sheffield, this is Linda Carter. I'm a senior claims specialist with Great Plains Mutual. We received your document." Her voice was professional, unreadable. "We've reviewed the addendum you provided. Our position remains that your current policy, the Agri-Shield policy you've renewed annually, is the controlling document. The coverage terms from 1961 are not applicable. The denial stands." Donald felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd been so sure the paper would settle it. "It was signed by your agent," he said. "It's part of the policy." Ms. Carter sighed, a soft sound over the phone. "Mr. Sheffield, that was 62 years ago. The company that issued that addendum, Farm Bureau Mutual, was acquired decades ago. The agent is deceased. The policy number no longer exists in our system. The addendum refers to perils covered under a policy that is obsolete. We insure you under a completely new, modern contract. I'm sorry, but we cannot honor a handwritten note from the Kennedy administration." She wasn't angry. She was final. This was a wall, and she was the voice telling him the wall wouldn't move. "What do I do now?" Donald asked. "You can appeal the denial internally. The process is outlined in the letter you received, or you can seek legal counsel. Those are your options. Good day, Mr. Sheffield." The click of the call disconnecting was the loudest sound Donald had heard since the tornado. He sat on his porch that evening, the denial letter and the faded addendum side by side on the wooden table next to him. $1 billion company on one side, a dead man's handwriting on the other. He knew what his grandfather would have done. Walter hadn't fought the Hale Insurance Company with just words. He'd gotten a lawyer. The next morning, Donald put on his cleanest shirt and drove to Colby. He didn't go to a big firm. He went to a one-story brick building on a side street, the office of James Corrigan. Corrigan was in his 60s, a local attorney who handled wills, property disputes, and the occasional lawsuit against a feed supplier or an equipment dealer. His waiting room smelled of old books and coffee. Donald laid the two documents on Corrigan's desk. He told the whole story, from the storm to the phone call with Linda Carter. Corrigan listened without interrupting. He put on a pair of reading glasses and picked up the handwritten addendum. He studied it for a full minute, turning it over, examining the stapled holes, the faded ink. He let out a long, low whistle. "Donald, do you know what this is?" "It's my grandfather's addendum." "It's a rider," Corrigan said, "a policy rider. And in insurance law, a properly executed rider is treated as part of the insurance contract. It modifies the original policy. Forever." He put the paper down and looked at Donald. "The insurance company is telling you the modern policy controls. That's their first and best argument, but that's not the whole story. Insurance isn't like buying a new car. It's a continuous contract. You don't get a new contract every year. You renew the existing one. The terms can be updated, yes. But if an old rider was never explicitly terminated or superseded by a new agreement, it might still be alive. It's attached to the original policy number. And if that original policy number is the grandfather of your current policy number, then this rider might have traveled all the way down the chain, like a dormant gene." Donald stared at him. "You're saying it might still be valid?" "I'm saying we have a legal argument," Corrigan said. "A good one. The burden would be on them to prove this rider was canceled. Did you ever sign anything canceling it?" "No." "Did your father?" "Not that I know of." "Then they have a problem, because this isn't just a note. It's a signed, dated addendum from their own agent describing a specific building attached to the original policy. In court, a judge is going to look at this and ask the insurance company one very simple question. Did you ever tell this man or his father or his grandfather that this shed was no longer covered? If the answer is no, then the coverage may still stand." Corrigan leaned forward, but Donald, "Listen, they have armies of lawyers. They will drag this out. They will bury us in paper. They will offer you a lowball settlement, hoping you'll take it and go away. They will cost you time and money you might not get back, even if we win. Are you prepared for that?" Donald looked out the window of the office, toward the direction of his farm. He thought of the twisted steel in his field. He thought of his grandfather building that shed with savings from 5 years of harvests. He thought of the envelope in the drawer, preserved for 62 years. "I'm prepared," he said. "All right," Corrigan said, "then let's send a letter." James Corrigan spent the next 2 days researching. He didn't just draft a simple appeal. He built a case. He found the Kansas statute that defined insurance riders and their binding nature. He found a case from 1998 where the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that an old, forgotten rider on a farm policy was still enforceable because the insurer had never formally notified the policyholder of its termination. He wrote a 6-page letter to Great Plains Mutual. It was polite, precise, and lethal. He cited the statute. He cited the case law. He included high-quality copies of the 1961 addendum. And he made a formal demand: honor the coverage as outlined in the rider, pay the claim for the total loss of the machine shed and its contents at today's replacement value, and do so within 30 days. Failure to do so, the letter concluded, would leave them with no alternative but to file a lawsuit for breach of contract and bad faith refusal to pay a valid claim. He sent it by certified mail to the headquarters in Des Moines and to the office of the General Counsel. Then they waited. The response came not in 30 days but in 12. A voicemail from Linda Carter's supervisor, a man named Robert Hill, the vice president of claims. His voice was tense. "Mr. Sheffield, Mr. Corrigan, we've received your correspondence. We would like to schedule an examination under oath." Corrigan played the voicemail for Donald in his office. "Examination under oath, what's that?" "It's a formal recorded questioning," Corrigan explained. "Like a deposition but in an insurance dispute. They have the right to do it. They'll put you in a room with a court reporter and one of their lawyers. They'll ask you every question imaginable about the shed, the storm, your family history, your grandfather, that document. They're looking for inconsistencies, for any tiny crack they can use to say you're committing fraud or that you misunderstood the coverage. It's a pressure tactic." Donald felt a knot form in his stomach. "Do I have to do it?" "If you want to pursue the claim, yes. If you refuse, they can deny the claim for non-cooperation. It's in the fine print of your modern policy." "So I have to go." "You have to go," Corrigan said, "but you won't be alone. I'll be there, and we will be prepared." The examination under oath was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. in a conference room at a law firm in Topeka, a 3-hour drive from Donald's farm. Donald wore the same suit he'd worn to his father's funeral. Corrigan wore a dark blue suit. They were met in the lobby by a young, serious-looking woman who led them to a windowless room on the 10th floor. 3 people were waiting. Robert Hill, the claims vice president, a man in his 50s with a carefully neutral expression. A lawyer for the company, a woman named Amanda Pierce, sharp-eyed and holding a legal pad. And a court reporter, her fingers poised over a stenography machine. The room was cold. The introductions were frosty. Donald was sworn in. The court reporter began recording. Amanda Pierce led the questioning. She started easy. Donald's full name, his address, how long he'd owned the farm. Then she moved to the storm. He described it. She asked about the damage to the barn, the house. He answered. She asked about the machine shed. When was it built? "I didn't build it," Donald said. "My grandfather, Walter Sheffield, built it in 1961. "Can you describe it?" "Steel frame, 30 by 60, concrete floor." "Did you make any improvements to it after you inherited the farm?" "I replaced the roof panels in 2004. I installed new lighting in 2010. "Did you ever notify Great Plains Mutual or any prior insurer of these improvements?" "No." Pierce made a note. She then turned to the insurance history. Did Donald have any documents showing the continuous chain of insurance from 1961 to the present? "I have the renewals for the last 15 years, Donald said, "in a file at home. Before that, my father kept them. I believe they exist." "But you don't have them with you today?" "No." Pierce paused. She opened a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table to Donald. It was a computer-generated document titled Policy History Summary. "This is our reconstruction of your policy history, Mr. Sheffield. It shows the policy number changes through acquisitions. The Farm Bureau Mutual Policy from 1961 is listed as the original. Then it was converted to a Midwest Agri policy number in 1982 when the first acquisition happened. That was converted to a Great Plains Mutual number in 1999. Do you see?" Donald looked at it. It was a flowchart of numbers and dates. He nodded. "Now," Ms. Pierce said, her voice growing sharper, "our digital records show no active riders or endorsements attached to any of these historical policy numbers for a machine shed. None. The first and only mention of this structure in our system is your claim filed last month. How do you explain that?" James Corrigan raised a hand. "Objection. The question assumes the digital record is complete. We have a physical document that your company created that proves otherwise." "This is an examination, not a deposition, Mr. Corrigan," Pierce said coolly. "I'm allowed to ask. Mr. Sheffield, how do you explain that our system shows no record of this shed being covered?" Donald took a breath. He thought of his grandfather at the kitchen table. "I explain it," he said slowly, "because my grandfather didn't put it in your system. He put it on a piece of paper, And your agent, Mr. Dobbs, put it on that paper too. He stapled it to the policy. He told my grandfather to keep it. That's the record." Pierce leaned forward. "Mr. Sheffield, is it possible your grandfather intended that addendum to be temporary? Perhaps for the first year after construction, to ensure coverage during the building phase?" "No," Donald said, his voice firm for the first time. "It is not possible. He built it to last. He insured it to last. He was a careful man. He wouldn't have bothered if it was just for a year." For the next hour, Pierce chipped away. She asked about the contents of the shed, demanding detailed lists and receipts Donald didn't have. She questioned the shed's primary use, hinting that if it was used for any business beyond the farm, it might be excluded. She asked if Donald had ever submitted a claim before. He had not. She circled back to the addendum again and again, her questions designed to plant doubt, that the handwriting was ambiguous, that the description was vague, that the word permanent might not mean what he thought. Through it all, Donald answered simply, directly, and truthfully. He was exhausted, but he didn't break. Finally, Pierce turned to the addendum itself. She held up the copy Corrigan had sent. "This document, Mr. Sheffield, you found it in a kitchen drawer." "Yes." "Was it in an envelope?" "Yes, a brown envelope." "And what did the envelope say?" "It said Farm Insurance, Policy and Addendum, 1961. "In whose handwriting?" "My grandfather." "And you're certain this is the original? It's not a copy your father might have made?" "I am certain. The staples are old, the paper is yellow, the ink is faded. It is the original." Pierce put the paper down. She looked at Robert Hill. Hill gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Mr. Sheffield. That will be all for today." The court reporter stopped recording. The examination was over. Donald and Corrigan gathered their things and left without another word. In the elevator, Donald felt shaky. "How did I do?" "You did perfectly," Corrigan said. "You were consistent, you were credible, you didn't get angry, you didn't guess. You just told the truth. That's all we could do." "What happens now?" "Now," Corrigan said as the elevator doors opened to the lobby, "we wait again. They have the transcript. Their legal team will review it. They'll weigh the cost of fighting us versus the cost of paying. And then they'll make a decision." 2 weeks later, the decision arrived. It was not a check. It was another letter from Robert Hill. It was longer than the denial letter, more legalistic, but its core message was a shock. It acknowledged the existence of the 1961 addendum. It did not agree it was valid. Instead, it made a new offer, a compromise settlement. Great Plains Mutual, without admitting any liability or coverage, offered to pay 40% of the estimated replacement cost of the shed and 20% of the stated value of the contents. It was a fraction of the claim. The letter stated this was a goodwill gesture to avoid further litigation, and that acceptance would require Donald to sign a full release of all claims forever. Corrigan read the letter aloud in his office. When he finished, he tossed it on his desk. "The squeeze," he said. "They're squeezing you. They're admitting the document has power or they wouldn't offer a dime, but they're offering just enough to make a weary man think about taking it and ending the pain. It's a tactic." Donald looked at the number. It wouldn't rebuild the shed. It wouldn't replace his tools. It was an insult. "What do we do?" he asked. "We say no," Corrigan said, "and we raise the stakes." He drafted a one-page response. It rejected the compromise offer entirely. It reiterated the demand for full payment. And it added one new sentence, a sentence that changed everything. "If this matter is not resolved satisfactorily within 10 business days, we will have no choice but to expand our litigation to include a claim for punitive damages based on your company's bad faith conduct in ignoring a clearly valid, binding policy rider." Bad faith. Those two words in insurance law are nuclear. A bad faith claim means the insurer didn't just deny a claim, it acted dishonestly, unreasonably. If you win a bad faith case, the company doesn't just pay the claim. It pays the claim, plus your attorney's fees, plus damages for your emotional distress, plus punitive damages. A financial punishment meant to make an example of them. Corrigan sent the letter. He knew it was a gamble. It could make them dig in their heels forever, or it could force a real negotiation. They got their answer in 7 days. A phone call from Amanda Pierce, the lawyer who'd conducted the examination. "Mr. Corrigan," she began, her voice stripped of its earlier chill, "my client is willing to discuss a resolution. We propose a meeting, not in Topeka, in Colby, at your office, with Mr. Sheffield present." Corrigan was stunned. They were coming to him. "Who will be attending?" he asked. "Myself," Ms. Pierce said, "and Robert Hill, and a third party from our Historical Policies Division." "When?" "Next Thursday, 10 a.m. Corrigan agreed. He hung up and called Donald. "They're coming here, Donald, to Colby to talk." Donald felt a surge of something, not quite hope, but a fierce determination. Why? Why would they come all the way here? Because, Corrigan said, they found something, or they're afraid of something. Either way, they wouldn't make this trip just to say no again. They're bringing someone from Historical Policies. That means they've been digging in their own archives. "What do you think they found?" "I don't know," Corrigan said, "but be ready. This isn't over. This is where it really begins." The following Thursday, at 9:45 in the morning, a black sedan pulled up outside James Corrigan's small brick office in Colby. 3 people got out. Amanda Pierce, the lawyer, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Robert Hill, the claims vice president, looking even more tired than he had in Topeka. And a third person, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled into a bun, wearing a simple cardigan and carrying a large, old-fashioned accordion file folder. This was Eleanor Vance, from the Historical Policies Division. They filed into Corrigan's modest conference room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Donald sat beside Corrigan, his hands folded on the table. He nodded at the newcomers but didn't speak. Amanda Pierce began. "Thank you for hosting us, Mr. Corrigan, Mr. Sheffield. We're here to see if we can find a path to resolution." Her tone was conciliatory, a complete shift from the examination. "The path is simple," Corrigan said. "You honor the writer and pay the claim in full." Robert Hill cleared his throat. "It's not that simple. Our position on the legal enforceability of a 62-year-old handwritten note is unchanged. However," he paused, glancing at Eleanor Vance, "we have conducted an internal review. Ms. Vance." Eleanor Vance opened her accordion file. She pulled out several sheets of photocopied paper, old and grainy. She slid one across the table to Corrigan and Donald. "This is a microfiche scan from our archived records warehouse in Des Moines," she said, her voice soft and precise. "It is the original underwriting file for policy number 4721, issued to Walter Sheffield, dated April 3, 1961. Donald looked at the copy. It was a carbon copy of a typed form, blurry but legible. At the top was his grandfather's name, the farm's legal description, and the policy number. At the bottom, a section titled Special Endorsements Writers. And there, typed on a line below, were the words, "See attached handwritten writer Ray, new machine shed." Corrigan's eyes widened. "Your own underwriting file references the writer." "It does," Eleanor Vance confirmed. "The file also contains a memo from the agency manager, dated April 10, 1961, approving the writer for issuance." She slid another photocopy across. It was a brief memo from a man named Peterson, the branch manager, to Henry Dobbs. It read, "Writer for W. Sheffield Shed approved. Attached to policy. Insured has copy." The room was silent. The insurance company had just proven Donald's document was real, official, and approved by their own predecessor company. Amanda Pierce spoke into the silence. "This confirms the writer was created. It does not confirm it survived the series of policy conversions and acquisitions. When Farm Bureau Mutual was acquired in 1982, all active policies were converted to new numbers. The conversion software at that time was primitive. It was designed to transfer core coverage terms, not ancillary riders, unless they were flagged in a specific data field. Paper files like this, she gestured to the photocopies, were boxed and sent to storage. They were not reviewed unless a claim was made. "So you're admitting it was lost in your system," Corrigan said. "We're explaining why it doesn't appear in our digital record," Hill corrected. "The question before us is contractual. Does this rider, from a policy that ceased to exist in 1982, bind Great Plains Mutual in 2023? "The law says it does if the coverage was never terminated," Corrigan fired back. "Did Walter Sheffield or his son ever sign a document canceling this rider?" Eleanor Vance spoke again. "We found no cancellation form in the archived file." She looked at Donald. "Mr. Sheffield, did your father ever purchase a separate policy for outbuildings from another company?" Donald thought. "No, he always said everything was with the same company, even as the name changed." Vance nodded as if this confirmed something. She pulled one last sheet from her folder. It was a claims form from 1988, a hail damage claim filed by Donald's father. The form listed damaged property: farmhouse roof, barn roof, machine shed roof. Corrigan snatched the paper. "This claim was paid." Vance nodded. "According to the payment ledger, it was paid in full. The machine shed was included in the settlement. No questions were asked." The impact of this was seismic. The insurance company had, in 1988, 27 years after the rider was written, honored it without even realizing it. They had treated the shed as a covered structure. This wasn't just about an old piece of paper. It was about a decades-long pattern of behavior. The company had effectively acknowledged the rider's validity by acting on it. Robert Hill's shoulders slumped slightly. The legal high ground he'd been trying to hold was crumbling. Amanda Pierce folded her hands. "This complicates our earlier position." "It destroys your earlier position," Corrigan said flatly. "You paid a claim on this same structure. You established a precedent. You can't now claim you never covered it. A court will eat you alive." Hill looked at Donald. "Mr. Sheffield, what is it you want?" "I want what the policy promised," Donald said, his voice steady. "I want my shed rebuilt. I want my tools and equipment replaced. That's all." Hill and Pierce exchanged a look. A silent conversation passed between them. Pierce gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "We are prepared to make a new offer," Hill said. "We will pay 100% of the replacement cost for the structure itself, according to current building estimates. We will pay 100% of the actual cash value for the contents, based on a detailed inventory you provide." It was a huge move, almost total victory, but Corrigan caught the nuance. Actual cash value, that means depreciated value. That's not replacement cost. My client can't buy a new welder with the money for a 10-year-old welder. The rider doesn't specify how contents are valued. The principle is to make him whole. Replacement cost is the standard for making someone whole. Pierce's lips tightened. "We are being more than reasonable." "You're trying to close a bad faith exposure for a discount," Corrigan countered. "Full replacement cost for everything. And we want the claim reclassified as covered, not a goodwill payment. And we want your company to cover my legal fees." Hill looked like he'd tasted something sour. "Legal fees are not covered under the policy." "They are recoverable in a bad faith action," Corrigan said, "which is what we will file this afternoon if we walk out of here without a deal. You've seen your own files. You know how a judge will see this. You ignored a valid rider, denied a claim, forced my client through an examination under oath, and only when confronted with your own historical proof do you even begin to negotiate. That's the textbook definition of bad faith. Do you really want a Kansas jury to hear that story?" The threat hung in the air. It was no longer a bluff. Corrigan had the ammunition now. Their own archives had given it to him. Robert Hill closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at Eleanor Vance. Ellie, from a purely historical continuity standpoint, would you consider the writer to have been in continuous effect? Vance chose her words carefully. Based on the file, the lack of cancellation, and the 1988 claim payment, yes, I would conclude the coverage was continuous. It was our error that we lost track of it. Hill let out a long breath. He looked at Pierce, then at Donald. Full replacement cost. For the structure and the contents, the claim will be recorded as covered under the terms of the historical writer, and we will cover Mr. Corrigan's reasonable legal fees. He stated it not as an offer, but as a final decision. Amanda Pierce opened her briefcase and began pulling out a draft settlement agreement. The fight was over. Donald felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizziness. He won. But as he watched Pierce lay out the papers, a new thought, cold and clear, cut through the fatigue. He held up a hand. "Wait." Everyone looked at him. "This writer," Donald said, pointing to the faded original on the table. "It says the new machine shed. It gives the dimensions and location. But my grandfather built another one, in 1965, a smaller shed for hay storage. He told me he did the same thing. He had Henry Dobbs write another addendum for it." The room froze. Corrigan turned to Donald, his eyes wide. "You have that paper too?" "I don't know," Donald said. "I never looked for it. I only looked for this one because it was for the big shed. The envelope in the hutch only had this one paper in it, but my grandfather was a man of habit. If he did it once, he would have done it again." Eleanor Vance went very still. "Do you know where that second shed was located?" "East of the barn," Donald said. "It was wood frame. It blew away in the same tornado. I didn't even claim it because I figured without a paper it wasn't covered. I was going to absorb the loss." Robert Hill's face went pale. Amanda Pierce stopped shuffling papers. "We need to find that second addendum," Corrigan said, his voice low and intense. "And if we don't find it?" Hill asked, dread in his voice. "Then," Corrigan said, "we have a new problem. Because if your company issued a second rider in 1965 and you failed to keep a record of it, and you've now admitted the first rider was continuously valid, then logically, the second one would be too. You've just agreed in this meeting to the principle of continuous coverage for undocumented riders. You might have just denied a claim on a structure that was also covered, which is a second, separate act of bad faith." The victory had just vanished. In its place was a deeper, more terrifying abyss. The insurance representatives looked at each other in sheer panic. They hadn't just come to settle one claim. They had potentially unlocked a vault of forgotten promises. Donald Sheffield looked from their stunned faces to his lawyer. The quiet farmer had one last question, the question that would now dictate everything that followed. "Mr. Corrigan," he said, "what do we do now?" James Corrigan looked from Donald to the stunned faces of the insurance executives. For a moment, no one in the room moved or breathed. Then Robert Hill, the claims vice president, put his head in his hands. Amanda Pierce, the lawyer, closed her eyes. Eleanor Vance from Historical Policies simply stared at the table, her professional composure cracked. Corrigan broke the silence. "We need to adjourn this meeting, right now. My client and I need to search his records. You," he said, pointing at Hill and Pierce, "need to go back to Des Moines and figure out what your exposure is. And I suggest you do not leave this county until we have something to tell you." There was no argument. The confidence they'd mustered to make their offer had evaporated. They packed their papers in silence and left. Donald drove Corrigan back to the farm. They went straight to the kitchen and pulled the entire hutch drawer out, dumping its contents onto the kitchen table. There were decades of papers, tax returns from the 70s, old warranty cards for appliances long dead, greeting cards, seed catalogs. They sorted through it all, sheet by sheet. After 45 minutes, Donald sat back, frustrated. "It's not here. Maybe he didn't do it for the second shed. Maybe I remembered wrong. Think, Corrigan urged. Did he have another place he kept important papers? A safe? A lockbox? Donald thought. His grandfather had been a man of simple habits. The hutch was for household papers. Then he remembered. The desk. The old roll-top desk in the front room that had been his grandfather. They went to the front room. The desk was dusty, covered in family photos. Donald hadn't opened its compartments in years. He lifted the roll top. Inside were neat stacks of envelopes, organized by size. One stack was labeled in his grandfather's handwriting, "Property." Donald's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the stack. The third envelope from the top was a long, business-sized envelope. On the front it said, "Hay Shed Addendum, 1965. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of Farm Bureau mutual letterhead, slightly less yellow than the first. The handwriting was the same careful cursive of Henry Dobbs. It was dated August 17, 1965. It read, "Addendum to Policy Number 4721. Coverage is extended to include the new hay storage shed, wood frame, dimensions 20 by 30, located east of the main barn. This structure is to be considered a covered outbuilding." It was signed by Walter Sheffield and Henry Dobbs, agent. Donald handed it to Corrigan without a word. Corrigan read it, a slow smile spreading across his face. He did it. He did the exact same thing. Your grandfather, Donald, was a genius. Corrigan took a picture of the document with his phone. He texted it to Amanda Pierce with a 2-word message. "We found it." The response was almost instantaneous. A phone call, Pierce's voice was hollow. "We see it. We need to reconvene." "Tomorrow," Corrigan said. "Same time, same place, and you'd better come with a checkbook." That night, Corrigan did more research. He searched the archived news from the local Colby paper for 1965. He found a small article in the August 20th edition in the Community Notes section. It read, "Walter Sheffield has completed construction of a new hay shed on his property east of town." The article was 2 sentences long. It was another piece of corroborating evidence, proof the shed existed at the time the addendum was signed. The next morning, the atmosphere in Corrigan's office was funereal. Hill, Pierce, and Vance returned, but the fight was gone from them. They had consulted with their general counsel overnight. The discovery of the second rider, identical in form and from the same agent, made their legal position untenable. Denying the hay shed claim now would be willful, reckless bad faith. A jury would punish them spectacularly. Amanda Pierce didn't bother with preamble. "We will settle both claims. In full. Replacement cost for both structures. Replacement cost for all contents based on sworn inventories. All legal fees. And a separate payment for the additional inconvenience and delay regarding the hay shed claim which we failed to investigate." It was total surrender. Corrigan pressed for one more thing. The settlement agreements must state clearly that both claims are paid under the coverage provided by the historical riders from 1961 and 1965, not as a goodwill gesture, not as a compromise, as covered claims. Hill nodded, too weary to resist, agreed. The paperwork took 2 weeks to draft and finalize. The final settlement amount was a number Donald had never dreamed of seeing in his life. It was enough to rebuild both sheds with modern, reinforced materials, replace every tool and piece of equipment with new equivalents, and have a substantial sum left over. The check from Great Plains Mutual arrived by certified mail. Donald deposited it at the local bank in Colby. The manager, who knew the whole story, just shook his head and smiled. Construction began the following month. The new machine shed went up first, on the same concrete pad but stronger, with a foundation rated for an F3 Tornado. Donald supervised every day, often thinking of his grandfather bending over the original plans. When the hay shed was rebuilt, he placed a copy of the 1965 addendum, laminated, inside a sealed PVC pipe and cemented it into the foundation. A message for the future. But the story didn't end with the rebuild. The ramifications rippled outward. First, within Great Plains Mutual, Eleanor Vance's Historical Policies Division was ordered to conduct an internal audit. They were tasked with physically reviewing a random sample of old paper files from acquisitions in the 70s and 80s, looking for other lost riders and endorsements. In the first month, they found 17 policyholders who had special, handwritten coverage terms that had never been digitized, that the company had no record of. The potential liability was enormous. The company quietly began a process of notifying those policyholders and updating their digital records, a costly and embarrassing undertaking. Second, for James Corrigan, he became briefly a minor celebrity in Kansas legal circles. He wrote an article for the State Bar Journal about the case, titled "The Dormant Rider: When 60-Year-Old Handwriting Beats a Digital System." He was asked to speak at 2 insurance law conferences. His practice saw a surge in calls from farmers and homeowners with old disputes. Third, and most importantly, for Donald, after the sheds were built and the tools replaced, he had a significant amount of money remaining. He didn't buy a new truck or take a vacation. He went to James Corrigan with a proposition. He wanted to use the money to create a legal fund, a small local resource for other farmers and ranchers in western Kansas who were fighting insurance denials or confusing contracts. It wouldn't pay for everything, but it would offer initial consultations and, in some cases, help retain a lawyer. He called it the Walter Sheffield Fund for Contract Literacy. Corrigan helped him set it up. The local newspaper ran a story about it. When asked why he was doing it, Donald gave a simple answer. "My grandfather's piece of paper protected me, but he only had it because he knew to ask for it and he knew to keep it. A lot of people don't know to ask, or they trust a handshake. This is to help them learn what he learned." There is a final detail, one that Donald didn't discover until a year after the settlement. He was cleaning out the roll-top desk more thoroughly, deciding what to keep for the family archive. In the very back of a deep drawer, behind a false panel his grandfather had made, he found a third envelope. This one was unlabeled. Inside was not an addendum but a letter from Henry Dobbs, the insurance agent, to Walter Sheffield. It was dated November 12, 1966. Dobbs was writing to inform Walter that he was retiring and selling his agency to a larger company. The letter said, and I quote, "Walter, as we discussed, I am retiring. The new company will take over all policies. I have personally reviewed your file and have instructed them that your 2 riders for the machine shed and the hay shed are permanent and binding parts of your coverage. I have put this in writing to them. However, based on our long friendship, my final advice is this: keep the original papers I signed for you. Do not rely on their system. Keep your copies safe. I wish you and your family all the best. Your friend Henry." Walter Sheffield had taken his friend's advice. He had kept the papers safe, and 62 years later, his grandson had needed them. Donald framed that letter. He hung it in the new machine shed, next to a photograph of his grandfather standing by the original building. It was a monument to a different time, when contracts were personal, and an agent's word was backed by a handwritten note and a warning about keeping your own records. The rebuilt farm stood as a testament to that old-fashioned diligence. And Donald Sheffield, the farmer who was almost denied everything, now sleeps soundly in the farmhouse his grandfather built, surrounded by promises made on paper, promises that outlasted tornadoes, corporate acquisitions, and the relentless march of time. This is where the specific story ends, but the mechanism it revealed, the power of a forgotten clause, the weight of a signature, the gap between a digital system and a paper promise, that story is just beginning. So what does Donald Sheffield's story tell us? It tells us that in a world of digital records and automated denials, the past is never fully erased. It sits in drawers, in attics, in forgotten files, waiting. A promise made on paper carries a weight that software cannot simply overwrite. The insurance company saw a claim that didn't fit their digital profile. They saw an unattached storage shed, an unendorsed structure, a line of code that said deny. Donald Sheffield saw his grandfather's handwriting. He saw a man's word made literal, and the law in the end sided with the handwriting, not out of sentiment but out of contract. A signature is a signature, whether it's in ink from 1961 or an electronic click from yesterday. This isn't just about insurance. It's about the quiet power of knowing what you own and, more importantly, knowing what you've agreed to. We live surrounded by contracts we've never read, terms of service, loan agreements, privacy policies. We click, I agree to documents longer than some novels, trusting that the fine print is standard, that it won't matter. We behave like Clarence Millard, Donald's grandfather's counterpart from the original story, trusting the institution because the person across the desk seems nice. But the contract doesn't care if the person was nice. The contract only cares what the contract says. Donald's victory came because his grandfather, Walter, was the exception. He was the man who asked for the promise in writing. He was the man who kept it safe. He was, in his way, as annoying as Russell Millard, the farmer who read every line. They were seen as difficult, paranoid, wasting time, until the day that time spent reading and filing became the most valuable investment they ever made. The systems are designed for our trust. They are designed for our haste. They are designed for us to assume that everything important is in the computer. Donald Sheffield's story is a reminder that sometimes the most important thing is in the envelope in the drawer, the thing the computer never knew about. Ask yourself this, not just about insurance, but about anything you've signed, anything you're bound to. Do you know what's in your file? Not the summary, not the explanation you were given, but the actual, physical, signed document. What clauses are sleeping there? What promises, made decades ago by a retired agent to your grandfather, might still be legally alive, waiting for a crisis to awaken them? Your story might not involve a tornado or a 60-year-old addendum, but it will involve a moment where what's written down conflicts with what you were told. And in that moment, only one of those things will matter. The difference between losing everything and keeping it often comes down to a single page. The page you read or the page you didn't. We find these stories so you don't have to learn the lesson the hard way. If you want to discover more narratives where the fine print changed everything, subscribe now. You never know what you might find.